exactly the word in the correct word. So Paul had I don't deny Paul had visions. People have visions of Mary, of Jesus, of anyone you like, visions of their dead mother. It happens, but you don't necessarily base a religion. So we know that Paul's vision that he had in Acts 29, in one of the accounts, people were with him, saw nothing. So it wasn't a bodily resurrection like seeing a flesh and blood person. No, it was a vision. So when Paul saw the resurrection, remember he said succession. First he appeared to Peter and James and John, then he appeared to me. So we can retrospectively say, so what Peter saw was a vision, what John saw was a vision.
No.
According to that logic. They all saw visions.
No, that's completely incorrect. They all saw the actual resurrected Jesus, excluding Paul. Paul comes later. I think Paul...
He said he did see Jesus. He said the last of those to be...
He wasn't among the 11 disciples who saw Jesus. He came afterwards.
Yes.
So saying that Jesus appeared to the 11 disciples first, and then me later, when that occurrence is separated by decades, technically it's not incorrect.
But he said that he appeared like he had before
not
to
in the
me.
Same instance.
Paul doesn't say that. He doesn't say...
We can contextualize that it wasn't the same instance.
But Paul says it's the same appearance. He appeared to Peter, then he appeared to me last of all. Are you saying that? We can look it up.
He is not saying that, for example, if Jesus arose on a Monday, that he appeared to me on the same Monday that he did the other 11 disciples. He's saying that the disciples were the first to see the resurrected Jesus, and then I saw them later, and it was almost like decades later, actually, I think, between the Paul becoming like one of the early Christians, and then Jesus ascending into heaven. He isn't talking about the same instance. We don't believe that Paul was one of the original 12 disciples.
No, but he had same. I've got the passage here. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and Paul is telling them about what he thinks the gospel is, which is very different from the gospel of Jesus. But that's by the by. So Jesus was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared. This is what he believes to Cephas, which is another word for Peter, and then to the 12. Right. So he's appearing to a succession of people. It's really important we grasp this. He appears to Peter, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive. Hang on. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles. Last of all, says Paul, as to someone untimely born, he appeared also to me. Right, we have a succession appearance. Now, the point is, though, when we look at the nature of this experience, according to the New Testament, it was a vision, not a bodily appearance. Therefore, likewise, all the other were also visions.
No,
it's the same appearance.
It could not have been a vision.
It's the same logic. He's not saying, oh, my appearance was completely different from theirs. I just had a vision. They saw the real body. He didn't say that. He appeared to them all and to me.
Asked to touch
the same
the
thing.
holes in Jesus' hands and in his side. So very clearly, Thomas experienced a complete difference. And not to mention that Jesus dwelt with the disciples for a number of days after he was resurrected, before he went into heaven. So we fully accept that the disciples had a different interaction with Jesus compared to Paul. We do not believe that they were all visions, because you cannot ask a vision to allow me to touch the holes in your hands and sides.
But Paul didn't say it was a vision in his letter to 1 Corinthians.
No, but
he says, last of all, as to one untimely born. He also, in other words, again, including what he had done to them, he appeared to me.
I think that's a key word, untimely born. So not born in the same instance of which the physical manifestation of Jesus was seen by his 11 disciples, the 500, and any other person who saw him before he physically ascended into heaven. That is not proof, by the way. I know we've gone like further away from where we were initially. But this gentleman was under the impression that Paul affirmed that the crucifixion and resurrection was not a real thing. And he quoted that verse to prove that.
No, I said the resurrection wasn't bodily. That was my argument.
Okay, sorry.
I didn't say the resurrection. He believes in crucifixion and resurrection, but it wasn't bodily.
But then don't forget that in the canon, we believe that the stone was rolled. There was no body in the tomb anymore. He could say the disciples stole them, but somehow they have to get past the two centurions.
There is more evidence, by the way. I've not exhausted all the evidence. There's other passages which say the same thing.
I don't agree with. But carry on, because the resurrection of Jesus was bodily, and that is the belief held by both Paul and the disciples.
I don't think so.
Yeah, but don't forget, he said, and to one untimely born.
He also appeared to me. He appeared to them, and he appeared to me. Remember, also he appeared to me.
Not in the same instance. So if I appear to you today, and I appear to somebody else 20 years in the future, and then the person records me appearing to you, and present them, it's not the same instance.
It's different in time, but not different in
Yes.
the
Yeah,
actual...
it's the same Jesus
but it's
appearing
different.
to them at different times.
Jesus appeared to the disciples physically.
But see the reading of it, does at least suggest that there are also divisions?
No,
You don't think
it
reading
was a physical thing because no one can interact with a vision. You can't touch a vision. But then Thomas did. Thomas touched Jesus physically, and that was the vision.
I don't think he did.
He asked to present Jesus' hands and side.
I don't think he
so
did.
that he could touch see the holes. So Thomas says. So Thomas
in the Bible,
I know, but I'm still saying no, and there's a reason.
Thomas was told
If you're interested.
that Jesus was resurrected, and he said, unless I touch the holes in his hands and on his side, I will not believe it. And then later Jesus appeared and then told Thomas to present this exercise so he could prove to him that he physically appeared. And the other disciples saw this as well. It wasn't a shared vision. He was actually there.
I don't think that's true.
That is what we believe to be true.
He said you can counter it.
No, I can, and it's a commonplace. Apologies in advance, it's going to sound boring and dry, but nevertheless, it's an answer. The fourth gospel, the Gospel of John, is seen by virtually all biblical scholars, including Christian biblical scholars, today, in fact for the last 200 years, is a highly developed, highly interpreted account. It's not seen as historical. It's seen as the last gospel written towards the end of the first century.
Okay.
And the stories in it are highly elaborated and embellished. And the story of Thomas touching Jesus, which is in John, you don't find any other earlier gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or anywhere else.
That's fine.
Hang on a
Because
sec.
it wouldn't make any sense
No,
for them
but
to repeat the same thing over and over again.
I knew it'd be boring. I did apologise. So, if you go to any mainstream biblical scholar, Christian or otherwise today, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Yale, whatever, they're all in agreement, and they've been in agreement for nearly 200 years. The history of the study of the Bible academically is a very sophisticated piece of scholarship. And if you look into this, you'll realise the Gospel of John is the least historical of all the Gospels because it has Jesus do and say things that no other earlier Gospel has him do and say. For example, he says, I am the light and I am the way, the truth and the life. Before Abraham was, I am. I am the all these wonderful I am sayings are not found in any other historical source. And we have earlier historical sources. And the argument scholars is this. If Jesus had gone around saying these things and doing these things as the last Gospel written claims, why does no one record him doing and saying these things? And there's not only a whiff of it in any other earlier source that Jesus spoke like that. Also, the other telltale signs that John is a much more interpreted, sermonizing account. Now, what's this got to do with the resurrection? Well, this story, which if it happened, surely would be an amazing story. And no, Mark knows nothing about it, neither does Luke, who's investigated everything carefully from the beginning. He boasts at the beginning. Neither does Matthew. No one else mentions it.
Yeah.
So this is likely to be a fictitious story made up, as John does with Jesus' sayings. This is your own scholars say this, by the way. These are not atheists. Your own top scholars are unanimous on this view.
There's no way.
Also, they debate the account of John, the Gospel of...
They all say that
no
it is,
way.
if you want the historical Jesus, you go to much earlier sources. You see, religious traditions embellish. There's stories made up in the later Muslim tradition about this person and that person. We go back to the original sources that are reliable. And unfortunately, John is not early. It's not considered reliable by the top Christian scholars and others. And yes, I can tell you who they are. The name of their books.
Are you going to say Bart Ehrman and Bruce Metzger again?
No, Bart Ehrman's an atheist, but nevertheless, he is a scholar.
But he just doesn't call him.
But it is standard. Look, Jim, I'll give you some names. I don't even know them. Jimmy Dunn, professor at Durham University, or people like Leslie Holden, Graham Stanton, Richard Burridge. These are all top professors in New Testament studies. They're all ordained Christians. All ordained Christians in Britain, and then we can go across to America or Germany. This is the standard view of Christian scholars now. The problem is, though, no disrespect to you, the average Christian, I'm not saying you're average, but anyway, the average does not know about this scholarship. There's this big gulf between those who know, who've investigated these, and the average man who doesn't know anything about it. And they simply open the Bible and say, oh, well, it says it there, it must be historical. But Christian scholarship has moved on hugely in the last 2 centuries. That's no longer the case. It's bad news if you're a Christian. When I was a Christian, I learned this when I was studying this at university. And boy, did it hit me hard. But we have to deal with the facts. Scholarship, responsible mainstream scholarship, no longer takes the Gospel of John as simple, unvarnished history. It's highly interpreted, late tradition. And it portrays Jesus in a certain way that no earlier source does. Nowhere is Jesus saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life in Mark or Matthew or Luke. It doesn't talk like that.
It would be redundant if all of the Gospels repeated the exact same thing, because then you'd only need one letter for the Gospels from the disciples who were there with Jesus. So it makes sense that they did not say the exact same thing at the exact same time. Inclusively, there are likely to be accounts that were picked up on by some disciples and not others. So when we read all four of the letters of the disciples, then we can get a more holistic view of what Jesus was. In relation to the criticisms of John, I am not completely familiar with all of those, but I would say that there is no indication that we should not take John as part of the gospel simply because there are claims by some scholars. I think
virtually, I said 99% of scholars.
I don't know about that.
I would say at least, well, I do.
Well, you named three.
I would say.
How many are there in total?
Well, look, should we go through university by university? Should we go from Oxford, Cambridge, London, Harvard, Yale? No, I can go through them. All the major scholars there are in complete agreement that John is a largely, heavily interpreted account, by which you mean fictionalized, unfortunately. For the historical Jesus, you go to the earlier sources, like you would the Hadith. You don't go to late Hadith, you go to early authentic Hadith. But these are your scholars, not me. Saying this.
It should appear on the earliest.
Thank you.
Brother,
rather than the newest.
Thank you.
It's redundant if all of the disciples who wrote parts of the gospel repeated the exact same thing over and over again.
Yeah,
Sorry.
but it should appear on the earliest gospel rather than the newest.
This is a good point, because Luke, for example, said that he was writing an orderly account to tell it. He told you the eyewitnesses to give an orderly account to you, dear Theophilus. So it says at the beginning of Luke, long before John was written, and in his account of Luke, Jesus' life, from his conception to his death and resurrection, nowhere does he ever have Jesus speaking the way and saying the things he does in the later written Gospel of John. He meant to be inclusive. Look at this. If Jesus had gone around, flesh and blood Jesus, downtown Jerusalem or Galilee, saying, I am the light of the world, before Abraham was I, making these extraordinary public claims, why on earth wouldn't Luke mention this? Why on earth wouldn't Mark mention this? Why on earth wouldn't Matthew mention this? Why would no one mention it until we get to the end of the first century? No one mentions it.
It has to be there.
It's not early, it's late. And that means, because we know in religious traditions, embellishments happen, exaggerations happen. We can see this even in Matthew, Mark and Luke. We can see how when Matthew and Luke use Mark, they embellish and improve the status of Jesus. He becomes more divine. He can do more things and more miracles. We see that.
If that is the focus which they wanted to capture in the retelling of the story of Jesus, that is fine. We have no issue with that.
Why would Luke ignore these marvelous public statements of Jesus? I mean, there's such an important facet of Jesus' ministry. Why ignore them?
I cannot give a reason as to why.
I mean, the light of the world.
He focused on other attributes.
I'm not going to mention that.
Simply because one does, or one makes these claims in their writings, but not the other, does not then mean that that one is to be ignored. These are all, reading all four will give you a holistic view of Jesus. And I doubt any of those scholars are of the mind that this book should be ignored or thrown out.
No.
So therefore, the lessons that are captured within John are poignant. And so when I talked about Thomas feeling the physically resurrected Jesus, simply because of the idea that John came later, and a number of the other Gospels does not mean that story must be thrown out.
No, it means it's late, because it is literally late. But
it
also means, if you look at
any of the scholars who you mentioned, would any of them agree that because of the criticisms for John, that then means that the resurrection was not a physical thing? Would any of them say that?
Yes.
Who? Okay, now we can discuss.
Okay, but let me explain.
Tell me of the scholars.
If you look at the earliest Gospel, the Gospel of Mark,
because John came later, that would then mean that when Paul speaks of the resurrection of Jesus, it was strictly sort of like vision-wise and not physical.
If you look at the earliest Gospel in the New Testament, the Gospel of Mark, we look at the resurrection appearances, yeah? No. There are no resurrection appearances in the Gospel of Mark. The earliest Gospel in the New Testament does not have any resurrection. But you'll say, you get the Bible out, you'll see stories have been added on. Yes, they have, but they're added on later, in the second and third set. How do we know this? If you go to the earliest manuscripts, the Codex Sinaiticus is the earliest complete New Testament manuscript in the world, in just 2 miles from here in the British Library. You can see it. I've seen it many times. It does not have any of these added on stories, because the earliest evidence, they were not there, they were not quoted. These have been added on by scribes. So I want you to quickly put on the resurrection of Jesus, because it's not there in our earliest Gospel.
It's not a full account of the Gospels, it's not?
It is. There are no resurrection appearances in the earliest Gospel in your Bible. That's a fact.
They are not a complete account of all the letters. I don't believe it does.
what you believe is okay. It doesn't alter the fact that there aren't any resurrection accounts, even if you don't believe it.
The Corner Static.
I'll show you. I've got the NRSV, which is the standard academic work. Okay, let's look. This is the New Revised Standard Version. It's the standard academic translation.
We are talking about the resurrection of Jesus, and he's claiming that Paul, a later apostle of Jesus, never held the belief that Jesus was physically resurrected. I disagree.
I meant it in the hard physical sense that John portrays it. Absolutely, he didn't believe that. And I mentioned the reasons why. Now, you see here, this is Mark. And here we have the shorter ending of Mark. Jesus appears to his disciples. And the longer ending of Mark. These are not original. They are added on. In most authorities, that is manuscripts, verses 9 to 20 follow immediately on. They're not in the ancient manuscripts. So these are added on. You see they've got the double brackets there and there. They're not part of the original Gospels. They've been added. Other ancient authorities, there are further stories. All these stories were added to the Gospel of Mark to include resurrection stories that weren't originally in the original Bible.
The Codex Sinaiticus is carbon dated for what? It's like, what is it, the 3rd, 4th century? Or
it's the middle of 4th century.
Okay, it's middle of 4th century. Clearly, these teachings have to have come from somewhere. So I believe that at the time, manuscripts were written on a very temperamental fabric called papyri, which would disintegrate over time if not properly kept in like a dry and cold fashion. So the complete gospels that or the gospel story that we have in the Codex Sinaiticus from the 4th century come from much earlier sources that date back all the way to the 1st century. I don't know if the Codex Sinaiticus has the entire Gospels within it.
Yes, it does.
I think there are potentially parts that are missing, but I will confirm that.
It is a complete New Testament.
That something was
it's the earliest copy we have. It doesn't have the resurrection.
So you're saying we find the earliest manuscript and it doesn't have the part of resurrection, and you're suggesting that this is a short version of what was originally there?
Yes, because we even have letters from church fathers from the 1st century who affirm the resurrection.
No, that's different. I'm not talking about. Of course, the fathers affirm the resurrection. I'm talking about the end of Mark.
As far back as the 1st century.
Yes, it was.
That the resurrection occurred.
Yes, of course.
So simply
it's there in Mark and Luke, and it's there in Luke and John and
simply
Matthew.
Because it does not make it. Now, sorry. With the Codex Sinaiticus, you're claiming that which section, doesn't make it in.
Right. I'm just saying. I have to say this already very clearly. The earliest gospel we have, which is in the Codex Sinaiticus as well, is called the Gospel of Mark. Now, the reasons why scholars think this, and we can go into that if you want, but I'm just telling you what everyone, all educated Christians know and accept. It's not a dispute. Mark is the earliest. In Mark's Gospel, the earliest manuscripts we have do not contain any resurrection appearances at all. Now, other Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and John do. I'm not saying it's not there in the Bible. I'm saying the earliest evidence is not there. That's all. It's a matter of fact. This is not in dispute, by the way. I'm not saying anything controversial or wacky or it's totally mainstream. Everyone knows this. You still have your resurrection. It's there in Luke or Matthew or John if you want it. I'm just saying it's not there in the earliest. That's all I'm saying. It's not there in the earliest Gospel. And when Paul asserts it, he's not talking about the hard corporeal resurrection you see in John. He's talking about a more spiritual resurrection. He actually calls it. There's more evidence I didn't go into, by the way, in his letters where he talks about flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. He's referring to the resurrection here. He believed it in a spiritual body. He called it a spiritual body. Now, in Greek metaphysics, a spiritual body was not a physical body. It was something ethereal, something more like a vision, a mist, something. It wasn't a hard flesh and blood. That's what Paul said in his letters.
Jesus didn't physically resurrect. Because it
depends what you mean by physical.
Jesus rose from the dead in a physical body.
What do you mean by physical?
Go find out. Go find out. It was new, of course. It's new. Jesus did not resurrect in the Old Testament. It was the new. Okay.
And there's a third piece of evidence as well to deny the resurrection of Jesus ever happened,
when I say
which is quite powerful.
Resurrected, I literally mean that the physical body of Jesus Christ was reanimated, escaped the tomb, and physically went and preached and stayed with the disciples disciples for, I believe, a month before, or 10 days, or one of the two figures before he physically ascended into heaven. And Paul does not affirm that this physical manifestation did not happen, simply that when Jesus appeared to Paul later, it was visual.
Okay, I don't agree. There's another more serious theological reason why I don't agree the resurrection of Jesus, death and resurrection, crucifixion happened.
A moment.
Okay.
If I may.
Yes.
We were talking about a very specific thing, which is to do with Paul.
Yes.
Not affirming that Jesus was resurrected physically.
Yes.
You make the case that he did not, and I make the case that the evidence that you're giving is not affirming.
I would say we have evidence it was resurrected. I would say we have evidence it was fabricated. We have evidence it's fabricated. That Paul fabricated. There's actual evidence in the Bible, which I can give. It's not based on. It's based on a very particular reading of the scriptures, and it's this.
A very particular reading. Okay.
Yeah. Well, indeed. Yours is a very particular reading as well.
As is yours.
I just said it was.
No Christian has ever believed that when Paul spoke about the resurrection of Jesus, that it was done in a non-physical way.
Well, they have actually in the early church.
Which Christian believed
that
when Paul spoke about, but then the Gnostics were then talked to by Paul, who then told them that believing in the resurrection metaphorically is not
but they disagree. They disagree with Paul and call Paul a heretic. So coming back,
is true.
Coming back
and
to
Paul told them that they were wrong.
Yeah, but Paul was wrong, and the Gnostics were right. I mean, it's just like he said, she said.
The Gnostics were not right because the disciples.
Well, they were right on this issue.
The disciples were not from the Gnostics.
Okay. Coming back to the real substantial reason why what Paul claims about the death and resurrection, death on the cross and resurrection of Jesus is an invented story. Is very powerful, I think. And remember, in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 3, Paul says that this is the gospel. And in fact, well, I'm going to more or less do it verbatim. The Christ, that's the Messiah, this is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, died for our sins according to the scriptures, this is the Jewish Bible, and rose again from the third day in accordance with the scriptures. He repeats this, in accordance with the scriptures, twice, at least twice. He's referring to Christ's death for our sins and resurrection from the dead on the third day, very specific. I'm right, aren't I? You did say this.
You are correct.
Thank you.
Physical resurrection, of course.
Well, you didn't say physical. That's not my point. My point includes that, but it's not limited to that point.
Well, he didn't say spiritual either.
Well, any form of resurrection didn't happen. Any form of Christian. Let me explain why. I'm giving the reason here. And it's quite easy to demonstrate. Okay, this is Paul's claim. According to the scriptures, the Christ, the Messiah, would die for our sins on the third day, be rose again from the dead according to the scriptures. This is the problem. You go to the scriptures. What are the scriptures? The Jewish Bible. Paul only had the Jewish Bible. Okay, he didn't have a Christian Bible. It didn't exist. It hadn't been written then. You go to the Christian Bible, a Jewish Bible, what the Christians call the Old Testament, Genesis through to Malachi, and you look at all the statements about the Messiah, and there are lots of statements about the Messiah. Never once will you find any reference to the Messiah, the Christ, predicting the Messiah will die for our sins, and then on the third day he will be resurrected from the dead. Nowhere in those scriptures does it say that. Why does this matter? Because Paul claims it does, so he's bearing false witness to the Jewish scriptures, but also the Jews themselves had never had any expectation, they still don't today, that the Messiah would die and that he would be raised from the dead. What do the Jews expect? The same expectation now as they did then. The Messiah is an anointed one, that's what it means, who is one like David, like the King David, the great king, who was anointed in 1 Samuel 7:14. Anointed, and he delivered Israel from his enemies, David did. And Jesus, as a Messiah, will do the same. It's nothing to do with dying on the cross for sins and rising on the third day. This belief is wholly absent from Judaism, it's wholly absent from the Jewish Bible, and therefore when Paul claimed this, he was speaking a falsehood about the scriptures, and that is the biggest evidence of all. If the scriptures, the Jews had said, yes, the Messiah would die for our sins, then yeah, that's pretty powerful. They never thought that. Before the rise of Christianity, there is no Jew known to history who ever said, ever expected that the Messiah would die, let alone die for sins, let alone die. No, but you say it's fine. But Paul claimed
he was rejected.
Paul claimed that this was the Jewish belief according to the scriptures, but it wasn't. So what happened in Acts? We read of Paul going to the synagogues. This is his evangelistic methodology. He goes to the synagogues in Athens and downtown Corinth or wherever and preached to the Jews. And how did the Jews respond to this message, which they must have known about? Of course, because the Jewish scriptures say that the Messiah would die and rise again. Yippee, they should have said. No, what they did was always they kicked him out. Get out. We don't know. You are alien. We know nothing about this message. It has nothing to do with our religion. This is fake news. That's how they all responded to Paul. So we know on multiple levels that it is a fake story. It's not rooted in the scriptures. It's not rooted in the Quran. It's not rooted in any revelation.
It wouldn't be in the Quran.
Well, indeed, because it's not true. That's why it's not in the Quran.
Really? So Jesus didn't get crucified?
Indeed.
Okay, well, yeah, it has to contain a lot of evidence to prove the otherwise.
Well, we have someone for whom history doesn't exist. Who is this someone? Allah. God himself is not looking back into history. All times are present to God. He knows with perfect clarity what really happened. And what does the Quran actually say? The Quran actually says...
So you don't have any evidence for this?
No, we do. We have evidence from God himself, which outranks Paul, even your Paul.
You don't have any physical evidence that Jesus was not crucified, despite there being multiple accounts of this happening in the first century.
No, but we don't. These accounts are written in this is a scholarly consensus. These are second generation accounts. They're anonymous. No gospel are claimed to be by a named individual, and they're not by eyewitnesses. These are not eyewitness accounts that you refer to. This is the standard scholarly consensus of all people that they're second generation, non-eyewitness, not by the apostles themselves. Matthew did not write Matthew, I'm sorry. John, the apostle, didn't write John.
That is not, there's not a consensus on that. Some people might have criticisms.
There is. Seriously, there is.
In that case, but with
Absolutely
Christian apologetics, they don't agree.
No, I'm not about Christian apologetics. I'm talking about historians.
There are other historians that don't find that to be the case.
Of course, apologetics are going to say that. I'm talking about historians.
They're not biased.
They're biased. I'm talking about historians.
You just said that we have the greatest historical account from Allah, because for him all time is the same.
Exactly.
So in that same way, you provided zero evidence for lack of crucifixion.
It's evidence, you don't accept it.
Huh?
It's evidence, you just don't accept it.
The evidence comes from God himself.
When you,
sorry, it ranks anything you say.
It's a little bit lazy when I say God did it, therefore it must be true, when there are certain things that we can verify more closely with actual tangible evidence.
But you do the same thing though with the Bible. So you're bringing up
what is your evidence?
Bible,
what is your evidence? Second generation anonymous accounts, not written by eyewitnesses.
And
is your
evidence is then 7th century.
No, it's not 7th century. The Quran is the actual speech of Allah. God is not 7th century. It is beyond space and time.
That wasn't there at the instance of the crucifixion, and then you want me to believe that over the second
God
generation.
is present in all times. Your counts are second generation by the non-eyewitnesses. It's an inferior account to what God himself has provided.
I don't accept doing God versus human beings for evidence.
I thought you were Christian. Of course we believe God taking precedence over human.
Okay, wait.
I thought you were Christian.
Let me rephrase that. Huh? Sorry?
Yeah.
No,
Thank you. And Judaism does not believe in a Messiah who died and rose again. It's not taught it. Thank you.
I'm not saying that simply in terms of age.
Thank you to that gentleman. Making a good point.
No. That's not my argument, because essentially, if there's evidence of a physical evidence of an event occurring, but then he tells me that because God said so, then sorry. No, but the Quran is not physical evidence of Jesus being crucified or not being crucified.
It is.
It's simply just an account.
It's a book.
That claims.
It's got a book. It's
Yes, but the problem is that the writers of the Quran were not there at the crucifixion. The writers of the Quran
God is
present.
No. The Quran is the speech of God. It's not written by people.
The belief is that they were present. The writers of the gospel were present at the crucifixion.
What he said?
Huh?
What he said? He brought forward scholarly critique.
They are there. These are people who you can.
He says Christian apologetics disagrees. No, that's what seriously his response. That's not because he's got some website. That's not an argument. I'm talking about serious historians here. You happen to be professing Christians as well, mostly.
We can provide
don't believe
evidence that they wrote it from people who studied with them. Yes, compared to what is provided by the Quran, which is simply a statement, definitely yes.
What's the difference between Bible statements?
So you have also extra biblical statements that support the idea that Jesus was crucified. Like for example, let us
Quran to the Bible. You can't compare it to.
Do you have any eyewitness accounts? Do you have any eyewitness accounts?
There is no comparison.
The eyewitness accounts are believed to be the writers of the four Gospels.
But
Matthew, Mark, Luke,
you say
and John.
believe, but they're not believed by modern Christian historians to be eyewitness accounts.
And I'm sorry, do modern Christian historians believe that Jesus wasn't crucified?
Oh no, they're Christians. They're Christians. Of course they wouldn't believe that.
The problem is that
Wouldn't expect them
we're using two slightly different means of measuring here. So yes. So simply because in the Quran God says something and doesn't provide any evidence for it, does not then mean that evidence is
God
like
needs to provide evidence of his own word. That's so bizarre,
You're
isn't
asking
it?
God to provide evidence.
No, I'm saying that simply because. Sorry?
Yeah, what's the eyewitness account?
There are eyewitness accounts that,
Okay.
that are attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And if you're looking for an eyewitness account, where is that in the Quran? Are you going to say God's story?
Let's look at this evidence in more detail. Let's look at the earliest gospel. We've already looked at Gospel of Mark. We've already seen that all the resurrection appearances, which are in our modern Bibles, are not actually there in the original gospel. That's beyond dispute. I don't know.
I don't agree
excuse
with
me.
that. I don't agree
You
with
don't.
that.
That's fine. But I recommend you investigate this for yourself. It's
I don't
well
agree with
known
that.
amongst
No.
historians. No, second.
You
But now I
are
want to come to the
phrasing
crucifixion.
it in a way.
Can I come to the crucifixion now? The crucifixion is mentioned in
Some of the
Mark.
evidence in the Quran too about.
But let's see what it actually says, okay? Because in John, the last gospel, we have disciples, we have Mary, we have John at the very base of the crucifixion itself, looking up at Jesus. It's often portrayed in Catholic art in churches, actually. But look at the earliest evidence. What do we see? All of the disciples, according to Mark, I'm not saying this, Mark is saying this, all the disciples scarpered. They ran away, all of them. But, look, it's a bit more. Some of the women, it says, saw the crucifixion at a distance. In my NRSV, that's exactly the English expression that's used. So all the disciples disappeared, they weren't around, they didn't witness anything. Some women at a distance saw what they thought was Jesus being crucified. And that is the earliest gospel witness to the crucifixion of Jesus. It's not very great, is it? And then we look at Paul. But Paul says that Jesus, yeah, he did. Paul never met Jesus. He never saw him once in his lifetime. So he is relying on hearsay. He's relying on stories he's heard.
We affirm that he had a vision of Jesus.
Oh, he had a vision.
Yes.
People have visions of Mary and Buddha and Margaret Thatcher, visions of their mothers. What does it prove?
I can have a vision today that he's
He had a vision of his cat. Well, maybe not. But you know what I mean? It doesn't prove anything. Yeah. Visions do not, particularly when people with
Visions don't prove anything.
Exactly.
So,
Yes.
the account in the Quran
I can tell him, yes.
that Jesus was not crucified.
Yes.
How do we substantiate this?
Right. The Quran is actually very sophisticated in what he says, very tantalizingly brief. I wish it was more, but it is very brief.
Made it appear as though somebody...
Thank you. It doesn't contradict.
How do we substantiate this?
The Quran says that it appeared to them, the Jews specifically, that he had been crucified. So what do we find? That the Jews, some of them thought that he had been. The appearance was given. So this doesn't contradict anything. The Quran doesn't contradict because it said that it appeared to the Jews, or some of them, that he had been crucified. Therefore, it doesn't contradict the historical echo we have. Because some people thought they had seen him.
The contradiction is that somebody else was made.
It doesn't say that in the Quran. It doesn't say that in the Quran.
God made it appear that somebody. God made it appear as though he was crucified.
Right.
So
I've heard someone else.
I've heard some scholars say that he was swapped out.
That's not what the Quran says. That's not what the Quran says.
I've heard some people say that he was swapped out, and I've heard people say that his spirit left him and was later put back into him later.
That's later Christian tradition, Muslim tradition. We're talking about, well, the Quran itself doesn't say any of that.
What does the Quran say?
The Quran says to the Jews who boasted that they had crucified the Messiah, because it comes in the context of polemic that God is making against the Jews, but they killed the prophets, they boasted they killed the Messiah, they boasted that terrible things that happened to Mary. God says no, because the context matters here. It always gets lost when we talk about this. It's part of a sustained polemic against the behavior of the Jews, and also in their boast that they had killed the Messiah. No, God says they did not kill him. No, he did not. He was not crucified. Though it appeared to them that he had been, or the appearance was given. Yeah. Now, history records, funnily enough, that indeed that he was crucified because his appearance was given. But in fact, the Quran is very clear. He was not crucified. He was not crucified. God rescued him. And we even see that in the Gospels in Gethsemane, where Jesus, according to the Gospels, begs God to be delivered from the hour that is about to, ordeal is about to happen to him. And Muslims, that's what it says in Luke. And Muslims can believe that God answered Jesus' prayer and saved him. Why would a prophet who begged God to save him not answer? God saved Jesus, and I believe that's the Muslim story.
He mentioned that he was crucified.
See what he just laid out. See what he just laid out. Where's the contradiction now? You see the way he's laid out right now?
Yes.
He's saying it's perfectly
So do Muslims believe that
today.
Jesus was crucified?
No, sir.
No.
Here's the thing.
No, and because they don't believe
That's the Christian belief.
then therefore it does not line up with the understanding of Christianity. Because it cannot, because Christianity is belief in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. If you say that death did not happen, it cannot line up.
As a Christian, you believe that he was crucified and he ascended to heaven.
No. You're missing two steps there.
Wait, let me just say one quick.
Okay.
You think he was crucified. Quran says it appeared to them. So that means people who saw Christians who saw he was crucified. It aligns perfectly. There's
Exactly. That's my point. That's my point.
You believe he ascended
We
to
believe he
heaven.
died. You guys don't.
Well,
Therefore,
we believe that, so rather Allah raised him to himself. So we believe in the ascension of Jesus. That's why Jesus wasn't around, because God raised him.
you cannot make that argument when clearly
The verse
same
after
thing.
that one is
So contradictions in the Bible. So this is the thing that
Yeah.
is invested.
That is absolutely incorrect.
But if you think
Making it appear as though and something actually happening are two completely different things. The ascension that occurs later.
how would you know the difference? If it appears to be that and it actually was that,
Exactly.
how would you know the difference?
You wouldn't. A
because-
casual bystander,
because
women
we
seeing them at a
literally
distance
believe-
wouldn't know the difference.
How would they know?
The belief is
wouldn't.
that Jesus was crucified and died. So if anything else is saying something different, then that is not consistent whatsoever.
But the point that you are making here is there is no difference.
So
They're saying
the point that they're making is that ascension, crucify.
Listen,
But then they're missing parts in the middle.
No, they're not, according to Islam.
Contradictions in the Bible. How can you actually prove anything? Who was carrying the cross, for example? Was it Jesus? Was it Simon of Cyrene?
Up the hill, it was Simon of Cyrene, but he didn't get crucified. I think
But we know that because he's telling you, by the way, because he was there.
yeah, in the same way
but
that
you're just telling us as if you were there.
in the same
How do
way
you
that
know?
The author of the Quran can then tell us that Jesus was not crucified.
There is an evidence. You want to hear about?
Yeah, I love to read Arabic.
Can I just read the rest of this verse, which his brother's kindly given me? There you are. It's about the crucifixion in the Quran. So it said obviously they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him. But then they said, and indeed, those who differ over it are in doubt about it. They have no knowledge of it except the following of assumption. And they did not kill him for certain. Rather, Allah raised him to himself. And ever is Allah exalted in might and wise. There's nothing there that contradicts history.
continue. The next verse is
Oh, and there is none from the people of the book that he will surely believe in Jesus before his death, and on the day of resurrection he will be against them as a witness, etc.
That completely.
Thank you.
Well, certain parts of it are similar, but the fundamental messaging is completely different from Christianity.
he will be a witness in the hereafter that I've never been crucified, and he will account to you for that.
That is what you guys believe, but that is not what we believe.
But should we agree on the Quranic content on the situation?
No.
In the current one right now,
Absolutely not.
there is no contradiction between them, right?
Absolutely,
Because I don't know why you understand that point.
Because don't forget, the chronology of the story is told as though that Jesus was about to be crucified, and then some kind of illusion happened, and then he wasn't, and then in that instance he was then raised into heaven.
What did he just read out?
That exact thing. So it was made to appear that he was crucified, and then instead he. Great! It's great to see that God is so ambiguous. It's great to see. I think that's an issue. However,
What about contradictions? Isn't that ambiguous as well? There's so many ways.
no. Ambiguity would entail
Gethsemane,
that there is
Jesus
no
begged
definitive,
God to deliver him, to save him. We believe God answered his prayer and said, I will save you, Jesus. He believes
to be many
God
different
turned his back on
interpretations
Jesus
of
and let
what
him
that
be
could
horribly
mean.
crucified.
Was he actually crucified and his soul was
This is
removed
the
from him,
cruelty.
which some
The
scholars
cruelty
believe
of that belief
was
compared to the
was
mercy
somebody
and
else
love
put in
shown
his
by
place, Simon
Allah
Cyrene,
in the
which
Quran.
some scholars believe was somebody else's face put on his body.
So
The book of Psalms say that
at 5
Messiah
p.m.
will call out to you.
That would be great. The more detailed, the better is what I
But
say.
the more details you go into,
Do you remember the reference? Do you remember the reference?
Psalms 81.
Very well, and you can have the discussion. That's
Yeah, look it up.
However, claiming as though the account of the crucifixion in the Quran is one-to-one with what it is in the Bible is completely inconsistent.
No history.
There are
no contradiction
there
between
are
the
two
two.
similarities. However, you don't believe that he was crucified. We do. So clearly, that's a contradiction.
We believe it appeared to, so that fits it.
No, but you see, like
I don't know why you make a distinction, because the Quran says, one second,
no.
when you're saying one hand, this event occurred, and the Quran says it appeared to have occurred,
If you
why
say-
do you see contradictions
If
there?
you make a statement of something happening declaratively, I shot you, but then say something that's ambiguous, it appears that I shot you.
Yeah, those people
They are not the same thing.
But they go online.
What?
But they go online. They go in harmony,
No,
right?
no.
Why not?
One of them is declarative because one of them is rooted in reality. I actually shot you.
I think they are different.
If it
I'll give them
simply
that. I mean,
appears as though
Jesus
I
wasn't
shot you,
crucified in
then
Islam,
I
but he
could
was in
not
Israel.
have
That is
shot you.
different.
So that
Well, my level of
the two
appearances,
are
they're
not
the same.
consistent.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you believe that there were zombies walking in Jerusalem after?
Oh, the zombie apocalypse.
Yeah, exactly.
In Matthew 27.
They were not
I
flesh
never
eating.
heard any historian.
They're vegetarian. Vegetarian zombies. It's a new thing, a new bid'ah in religion.
They went back home and had dinner.
Were they vegans, perhaps? Were they vegans or
Went
vegetarians?
back home and had dinner. Kosher, of course.
Kosher.
Was it the parable or was it the historical fact that zombies walked into Jerusalem?
So
There were many of them.
that is something that is something I agree that is sort of like talked about in both instances.
Do you think it's history?
By sort of like scholars of Christianity. I have no hard set opinion on that because I do agree that if it happened physically, then definitely there should be some other accounts. But I also hold the same standard when things are talked about, like for example a moon splitting in the 7th century and nobody seeing it.
Oh, they did though. They did. There were witnesses. In India, there were witnesses.
Wait.
So you're wrong there.
How many parts of the world should have been able to see the moon?
During the day, well, half of that planet would not have seen it during the day because it's daytime.
So there should be multiple accounts.
There are.
Of the other half of the planet.
There are.
Seeing the moon split.
There are accounts, dude. Well, you need to look. You need to look them up. They're well attested at the time. There were accounts.
Okay. Fair enough. The moon has not been
But coming back to the zombie apocalypse.
Not to mention, if the moon is split, that would unfortunately have great ramifications for us on the planet. Because
Don't you believe miracles?
Huh?
Don't you believe miracles?
Oh, okay. So what was the
time
splitting?
But not saying the Bible.
It's a miracle.
He doesn't believe in the zombie
It was
apocalypse.
It
So
was a miracle.
Was the
because-
splitting a miracle
course it was.
in which a specifically visual miracle
Yeah.
in which all other constants of reality were not affected?
yeah, there were witnesses. There are witnesses.
Jesus raised from dead. How come?
One Moses split the sea. It was for everybody knows.
Yeah, because it's supposed to be a new world with new born again Christians who renew the creation. Yeah, it's just the same as it always was. There's no difference. So that's what Paul says in letters.
And it's written.
Check them out.
You know it's like
The ayah said,
Do you know why
the
it's
time has
inconsistent?
come and the
You know
moon
why
has
it's
been split.
inconsistent? Because you're saying for
The moon has not been
Jesus
split yet.
is a right to
From the
suspend
Quran.
the laws of physics.
moon has not been split.
science. Wait.
I
So,
said
but when it comes to music,
I believe it.
I have read about it. I'm Muslim.
As
No,
the idea of
I've got no problem with you believe resurrection Jesus and me believing Muslim because we both believe in the supernatural, both believe in miracles.
Fair enough.
We both believe in things
Fair enough.
where the decree of God can happen, right? When the
Fair
decree of
enough.
God, right? So like I don't know why you're doing this scientific explanation as to
This
what
thing
happened in
is
Muslim
al-alamat
after.
al-kubra.
Because you and I both believe
At the end.
in miracles.
raising
good.
people
Yeah,
from
good
the
point, good
dead
point.
and a moon splitting in half.
Which means when the time comes, the moon will split.
One of them
Well,
will
no,
have
I'm losing the will to live here. What did he say?
Apparently, the moon splitting is higher on epistemic weight of miracles.
For example, it will have ramifications on the control of tides.
In India, there's oil.
It will have ramifications over the
There's
control
oil
of
in India.
tides.
I thought the resurrection did. Yeah, nothing's changed. The resurrection is supposed to affect the created order, very poor. And yet, there's no difference.
It's the word
As a
itself in the
miracle
Quran.
that suspended all other functions of the moon.
You want those details?
It's a miracle.
It would help.
That's not the purpose.
It would help. Otherwise, then I can have this ambiguity and have these discussions with you. If it was definitive, then very well, we can have an explanation as to how it happened. However,
the purpose of the book is not to describe.
awesome. Okay.
mechanics
Well,
behind it.
unfortunately, as a result.
Describe how this
Unfortunately,
I'm looking at the zombie apocalypse.
he suspended the gravity.
absolutely, it's within God's power to do those things. But unfortunately, because that isn't stated, then I'm free
Yeah, just keep it a secret,
point
though.
that issue with it.
Account.
Sorry?
What would you do with an eyewitness account of that event?
I would need multiple, because definitely in the 7th century, there should have been multiple different individuals who could have been able to observe.
Maybe they were, but maybe they didn't have a pen and paper to write it down.
I mean, like, I mean,
Yeah, can I just share with you another serious doubt about, I'm looking at Matthew's Gospel here, which does narrate the crucifixion, absolutely, in chapter 27. In the same chapter, in the same story about the crucifixion of Jesus, at the same time it says this, okay, this is when Jesus was crucified, also historical according to him. The tombs were also opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. They came back from the dead. These are resurrections. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many people. So they went home to their families, presumably. A mass resurrection of the dead. So remember, the point is this: if we doubt this story, and all historians do doubt this story because no other historical source mentions this, we have a contemporary Jewish historian, Josephus, who is from Jerusalem, who doesn't mention this extraordinary mass resurrection of the dead. No other gospel mentions it. Luke doesn't, John doesn't, Mark doesn't, Paul doesn't. The apologetic propaganda value of this story would have been huge if it had happened. But if this is myth, notice what this means. If we doubt that miracle story, it comes on the same page, the same verses as the crucifixion story. The whole thing is cast into doubt. How can we rely on a text that claims this when it mixes fiction and myth with these claims? It's the same story.
That therefore everything should be thrown away.
Which extra biblical accounts?
I said I don't agree because one verse has an occurrence that does not have sufficient extra biblical accounts that then the entire chapter or page.
No, it's not. You misunderstand. If Matthew can, dude.
So in that instance, because you believe
Matthew can make stuff up.
I have no issue with that.
Thank you. The point is, if Matthew can make stuff up so blatantly about the zombie apocalypse, how can we rely on him completely in other stories he tells? The coinage is corrupted. What he's saying is no longer totally trustworthy. If he's been exposed as making stuff up about the zombie apocalypse, how can we be sure about anything else he claims? This is the problem. It's not really about the zombie apocalypse. It's about the reliability of the Gospels to give us the gospel truth, if I can use that pun. That's the point, which he's not listening to.
Dragonman asking, is that true to happen? The zombie apocalypse?
He already said he doesn't know.
So are you.
But historians,
How does he know the other part?
no historians have said that it happens. It just doesn't happen. It's myth. Because none of the source says it. Not just it's supernatural. No one else says it happens. And it would be multiply attested in the most amazing public event, even if it happened. More amazing than the resurrection of Jesus.
I like what we said about how the entailment has the resurrection. So if you reject that, you have that's faith with it.
It casts everything into doubt. That's the problem. And that's the problem with this article. It's that kind. Thank you.
Understand that, for example, there are instances where
John Simone.
on the translation of a particular surah, for example.
They never sold it. They went
and then they would go to the prophet and ask which version of the right one.
They said both.
And he said the book. Yeah, so like it's interesting, man.
Talking about the zombie apocalypse and the reliability of Mark, Matthew, and etc. etc. Usual stuff.
And you can see
He's the Christian. The rest are Muslims. Poor chap. I think so.
But I would.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
I want to hear.
Oh no, but it means the same thing. That's the same word, different pronunciation. But then when you have
Malik.
no.
On the rest of that.
Now they're going to play that.
Same word, different pronunciation.
Before you go into Haruf, can you? I want to hear your answer to what he said. The verse you brought from Matthew right now.
Yeah, the problem is if Matthew is shown to be unreliable historically.
I already said that because one instance does not have sufficient extra biblical accounts of it occurring, does not then mean that you should throw away all the other occurrences in that same chapter or book.
But that's not the point. Is that Matthew is making a story up from fiction. It's a myth. It's a falsehood. Not that there's not independent corroboration. There's an actual falsehood. Therefore, if he could do that about one story, it contaminates all him. How can we be reliable?
No, it does not. There is no instance where by simply making one claim that does not corroborate with the physical reality, therefore everything else made is completely...
but historians say that it's a made-up story,
okay,
and I agree with them. Therefore, if he makes
that is fine.
Well, they all do. I've never come across an historian, to be honest, whoever says this actually happened.
In this world, you can find anything you look for.
No, these are Christians I'm talking about. Christians.
Is it fictional?
I think it doesn't necessarily matter if that story is... No,
of course it matters. There's a mass resurrection of the dead in Matthew. It doesn't matter?
It doesn't
Matthew
matter
thought it mattered.
If it's physical or not physical, because ultimately that has nothing to do with the core doctrines of Christianity. So if somehow believing in that,
it's the resurrection of the dead is a core. The resurrection of the dead is a core Christian belief.
No,
Matthew says that loads of people rose from the dead.
Disbelieving it.
Everyone knows it's a fake story.
You don't believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus. The important thing for us is that we believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus. And to have an Islamic comparison, for example, the Isra and the Miraj, right? Was that physical? Was that spiritual? Doesn't really matter. The important thing is that the context of the story is what is then carried on by the believers going forward. So when it comes to that instance, it is not important to believe or disbelieve in the idea of those particular dead rising. What is important to believe is the death and resurrection of Jesus. So I think it would be great if we had other biblical accounts of the dead rising. But to my knowledge, I haven't come across any. So that's my answer.
Yeah,
but that's what you
it's a false story.
But the Bible says many things. So if someone is not a Christian, he would just look at it as a text, as a historical text.
I think
find many things.
Absolutely, and I think everything should be read in this context.
Someone give it.
That's all.
I know.
I must say this is kind of nice. Like normally, when I have
I can't go anymore. Yeah, he's not going to listen.
That's fine. No combo is pretty good. Yeah, whenever I talk to Muslims, it gets heated normally, but you guys are pretty good. So shout out to you.
But back to the Matthew account. So you're saying it doesn't really matter.
No, it doesn't.
But as a Christian,
Matthew did. Matthew did. He wrote about it.
Yeah,
That's fine.
Well, yeah, he disagrees with you.
But do you accept his point though about being consistent, about the idea that if you're going to affirm the resurrection, if you're going to deny, if you're going to say that was fictional,
then
that
everything
metaphorical,
else,
then the rest of the paragraph was resurrection.
I don't agree.
Why not? Because that's going to be consistent.
It does not necessarily mean that, because simply because one thing does not have sufficient extra biblical accounts does not mean that then everything else does not.
No, it's not sufficient evidence. It's a false fabrication, made-up story. This is the consensus of historians. It's a made-up story.
If as a result of this,
think about it.
How
can it be true? Mass resurrections of the dead in broad daylight and left no trace on the historical record. No other gospel knows about it. And you imagine if you were a Christian in the
want to scrutinize
this is the best argument.
You can do that.
This is the best argument. If you were a Christian in the early church and you knew that there'd been a mass resurrection of the dead in downtown Jerusalem at the moment Jesus was crucified, okay, no coincidence. Yeah, just as Matthew said. Imagine it happened for a second and you were a Christian. What would you do? You sit there and say nothing. You wouldn't tell anyone, would you? Of course you wouldn't. You go out there and you preach about it. You say, isn't Jesus amazing? He rose from the dead. All these people rose from the dead. And it would be a fundamental part of Christian preaching and propaganda for years. And it would be all over the New Testament. And in fact, it would be all over the Jewish script. Everyone would know about this amazing story of the mass resurrection of the dead in broad daylight in Jerusalem at precisely the moment Jesus died. But the reality is, nothing, no one ever, no Christian ever made capital